then in the book, the spirit starts to talk about how you could come and visit the moon. Because 400 years ago, people didn't think of spaceships. There wasn't a lot of technology. There weren't any cars or anything. There weren't any machines. So how would you get to the moon? You get to the moon via spirit. So it's the spirit basically would come and gather you up if they like you, if you're not too heavy, and if you're not a fat German, and for some reason Spaniards are favored. I know Kepler was being a little bit satirical in the text. And it has to be during an eclipse, because the sun's rays would be very dangerous to you. So there's an eclipse, the spirits come down from the moon and the earth, and they do a little, like partying, and they basically gather you up. You have to curl up like a little spider, because you'll be shot up through the air like a cannonball, and if you let your arms trail out, they may be torn off. And the way you breathe in space is that they have a little sponge, moist sponge, that they tie underneath your nose, and then you'll be fine. And you'll be lifted up into the space, and then they push you, and then they basically leave you be. You float on your own accord, and then they sort of fly ahead of you and then slow you down as you sort of land on the moon. So Kepler really thought a little bit about how gravity, how inertia would work. Gravity hadn't really figured out, but he kind of had figured out that much. And then comes the boring middle part of the book. This is a student thesis. So if you read through the book and then suddenly, like 15 pages in, you go, oh, what is this? It's all about nodes and orbits and 220 days here and 15 revolutions there. And then it's like, this is why this book never got famous. This is the really boring bit. And it's super interesting if you see it in context of everything that he discovered. And also an interesting part to note is that if you read through the initial text, it's about 25 pages of story and 200 pages of footnotes, because he kept on making new discoveries, and then he would go back to his original text and make a little footnote say, I just discovered this, or I just thought about that. And so it makes a very interesting read. You have basically a bookmark in the text, a bookmark in the footnote, and the bookmark for the footnotes of the translator. So it's very involved. And at the very end of the book, like the last 2 or 3 pages, is where it gets really interesting. There he talks about the prevolvents and the subvolvents. Those are the creatures who live on the moon. And there are 2 different races. So the subvolvents, they live in that's on this facing side of the moon side that we always see. And it's always illuminated either by the sun or by reflection from the earth. So these would be creatures who would always have some sort of sunlight. And they would be very pleasant and lovely creatures, and they would do nice things. But the ones on the far side of the moons, the prevolvents, so because they would be deprived of sunlight, and subvolvents because they would always be under sunlight, they would be nasty creatures, and their geology would be very harsh. You would imagine the water evaporating or disappearing, and so they would be sort of more horrible. So it's a very interesting thought process that he developed. Oh, and the reason why they are fish, 400 years ago, people thought the dark spots on the moon were oceans and seas. Now we know it's just basalt. But I think it's much prettier to think of them as oceans and seas. And of course, there would be fish living there. So I did a whole series of moonfish. Then he goes on a bit about explaining what the creatures look like, that they would grow very large and that they'd be spongy, and then suddenly they wake up. Again, a very strange ending for the book. I think he just ran out of ideas, and then suddenly goes, oh, and then he sort of turned around and he found like his bed cover had slipped over his head, and he woke up. And it's like the story was just getting good. So as I was working with this text, I ran into this weird dead end, and I started just basically doing other things with the text. I thought, I can't make more illustrations because the text is at an end. Maybe I can make a little book. So I made a little book that I gave out actually at an event in Montreal. We have this thing called Nuit Blanche, where a lot of cultural venues stay open all night long. And in my gallery, I basically put up my own work for a change. And I made these little books, and they were actually all these parts were blank, and people could put in their own stamps and illustrate their own first science fiction book. And I did the layout in 4 different languages: the original Latin, German, Kepler's language, and then English and French because it's in Montreal. But the story reads continuously through across the 4 languages. So that was a fun little project. And then I also used the book pages in something called shop dropping. I don't know if you've heard of this. Basically, you buy products and then that wasn't at all weird, Matt. So you buy products, and mostly cans, and I bought a bunch of cans of beans. And then you put new labels on them, like something arty, and then you sneak them back into the store and you put them, and then you document your drop. So it's reverse shoplifting. And it's fun because you're turning a supermarket into an art gallery. It's kind of a guerrilla street art kind of thing. And there was a whole movement in Montreal doing this, and it was a lot of fun, very exciting to sneak all your painted cans back into the supermarket, trying to look unobtrusive, and really nobody cares. Like you think like you have this big arrow over your head, like weird things going on right here, and nobody cares. And so you see here, I even stole some of these, and then I brought them back and I modified them, said art here. And I also, then in the end, this is normally where the prices go. So I basically used all the shelves as lines of text. So I would put poems across, so you walk down the aisle and you'd be followed by text. So you wouldn't no longer know what anything costs, but hey. And and also, I'm going to just roll back a little bit. You can see here, I always cut around the barcode so you could still buy the cans. So you could purchase them a second time, so the supermarket would make more money. And a couple of friends actually went and did that, because at the cash, the girl just goes, "Where's the barcode?" Eek, and nobody ever asked a question. So that was a fun project to do. And at the Montreal Biennale, a couple of years ago, they actually recreated a little supermarket, and all the participating artists brought their cans. And we took all the photos that we'd taken in the supermarkets, we just put them like around the room, so that was a really fun exhibit. I did this a couple of times, even after the Biennale. And also, if you ever want to actually read the Somnium, just the original 25 pages without the 200 footnotes, I subverted a Twitter account. It's called My COVID Voice, and I tweeted out the entire story. And the way I did this was in reverse, so that when you now read the Twitter feed, the story reads the right way up. So 240 characters worth in reverse. So as the whole Twitter feed was building up, people were wondering like what's going on, because you read the end of the story and you get like these random sentences, and then in the end, like now everything just reads. And so the book is online on Twitter.